So today we're here with Carel Struycken, and thank you, Carel, for taking the time. Many of you know Carel as an actor in the Addams Family and Star Trek and endless movies. And Carel's interest is actually in permaculture and ways that people can do more with less. And I interviewed Carel in my Self-Sufficient Home book. I'm sure everybody watching this has a copy. And one of the main things we started on was I was at your other residence and we were looking at all of your gardens, and you're an advocate of permaculture. And maybe for those who don't know what permaculture means, you could explain that?
Yeah, it's basically a way to work with what you have. So if you have a mountain and you need to retain water, it means that you build different horizontal, what do you call it?
Like a dam?
Yeah, not dams, but they're just some earthwork to slow water from running down so that it seeps in, so that you retain more water. What trees usually do, but if people want to farm, then they get rid of the trees.
So permaculture, Bill Mollison coined the word, and it means permanent agriculture, am I correct?
Yeah, because agriculture, the way it is done now, is more a form of mining than, because eventually, actually right now the biggest problem is that there's so much soil erosion, and
because of modern methods of farming.
Right.
Yeah. So permaculture, as you were practicing it and as you understand it, it can be applied really anywhere. I remember Mollison's book, the Permaculture Bible, whatever it was called. It went into great depth on all of the systems that should be in place, but essentially you're going by what nature does normally. Would that be your understanding?
Yeah, and you try to kind of optimize it. Mm-hmm. So you try to optimize retaining water, you try to optimize having a ground cover of some kind so that the amount of evaporation is lower. You grow certain plants around your fruit trees that provide minerals, that kind of get minerals from deep into the ground, mm-hmm. and provide it with the dead leaves of those, something like comfrey does that.
So in other words, you're doing, in many ways, you're doing less work, but it's not just negligence. It takes an understanding of your local area, that particular weather system. So it does take some study. When you were in a different place here in Pasadena, you had a big backyard, and although there were walkways, you didn't really rake or anything like that, did you? You let all the leaves become the fertilizer for your trees.
Right. And I remember getting in a huge discussion with a tree trimmer who said, you have to get rid of those leaves. I said, well, what about a forest? Is anybody raking
Nobody
the forest?
Rakes the forest, right. And actually, that's actually a classic example, because the forest is sustainable almost forever. I mean, it goes through cycles, but all of the leaves are just decomposing on the forest floor, mushrooms are growing, things are growing, and it's providing the nutrients for the next generation, for all the fruit on the fruit trees.
Yeah, and what I noticed in that area where I really had a thick layer of leaves was that it was just riddled with Mycelia all over. So there was this network of whatever a mushroom is underground, it's mm-hmm. called the mycelium. Mm-hmm. And mycelia really communicates, well, first of all, they provide a lot of nutrients to the trees.
Because it's breaking the wood chips and the leaves down.
But they also communicate between trees, so there's a lot of communication going on between trees, and it goes, the mycelia are kind of the network through which that happens.
What do you meaning communication between trees?
Well, I guess it has to do with if one of the trees is attacked by insects, that other trees know how that they should start producing more things to try to counter.
I see. So in other words, nature has this innate knowledge of what to do if we just let it. Now, isn't one of the big objections bugs too? People say, oh, you can't do all that, you can't have all that mulch because of all the bugs. Well, what was your experience with insects and bugs?
Well, I guess I was lucky. I was growing a lot of kind of leafy stuff, and what I noticed with lettuce was that I had a lot of spiders running around and inside the lettuce, but I never had any bugs.
Okay.
So clearly the spiders were taking care of the bugs.
They're eating them, right?
Yeah.
So that's the whole point. Modern agriculture, because it's attempting to feed with less labor vast volumes of people. I mean, if you go to a farm, it's like an ecological disaster. We consider that a necessary evil to destroy vast acreages with the tractors and the chemicals. And so is permaculture viable in a larger area to feed greater numbers of people, or is it something that people have to do individually in small plots?
It's done on a reasonable scale in some areas, but and it might be possible to do it on a much larger scale, but it requires a lot more thought. And what is happening now with industrial agriculture is that they just have thousands of acres, and everything up until very recently got kind of sprayed and fertilized indiscriminately. Nowadays they take a little bit more care. They can observe from satellites or from drones or whatever where there's water standing, where plants are in stress, and then they can act accordingly. But it's still much easier, of course, to just blast everything with.
So generally speaking, let's just say organic agriculture, that's still a minority of the bulk of agriculture, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
So we have a long way to go to have like food that's sustainable and healthy, right?
Yeah. Well, the argument is that if you would try to do everything organically, you wouldn't be able to feed everybody.
What do you think about that?
Well,
I've heard that argument my whole life.
Yeah, it's probably true, but...
You mean it's probably true if there was like a rapid transition to all strictly organic?
Yeah. But of course, the big problem is that the more you produce, the more people you get, and then the cycle goes all over again. So that's part of what agriculture has done in the world.
Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with a farmer named Joel Salatin?
No.
Okay, so he wrote a book called Everything I Want to Do is Illegal. I mean, he's a remarkable fella. I interviewed him once and we got to talking, and basically what he was saying is that if the government just steps out of the way, we could actually produce our own food. A lot of it is because it's government controlled. Number one, the word organic, you know that's like a federally controlled term.
Right.
So
and they always try to undermine it.
Of course,
yeah.
You can use Roundup in an organic farm if you're not supposedly you're not using it on the crops.
Right.
I mean, there's so much stuff that you would gag if you heard you can do that and it still be labeled organic.
Can you use Roundup?
Well, I had to take a course because I run a farmer's market, and I kept one of my questions was, what actually means what does it actually mean to be organic, to get certified? And it's not a simple answer. There's like a whole textbook of all of the ins and outs of what you can and cannot do, but they don't say Roundup per se. But there's things that you can use that you would. And what my thought is that if this is okay under the guise of being organic, getting the federal recognition, the non-organic conventional farms are far worse. You know, I still want to choose organic. I still want to support that pathway.
Well, in the last 10 years, a lot of people have become oversensitive to wheat, and they always say it's gluten. It's not always gluten. And what I recently read is that they spread Roundup on the weeds when they're ready to harvest it, to basically kill it off, so that they can harvest it if it's green.
They spray Roundup on the wheat so that it dies quicker and produces seed. Is that the idea?
No, it has already produced seed, but I think the issue is that you can't harvest wheat when the stalks are still green.
I see.
Because it will start to rot or whatever.
I see.
So they first kill it off so that it's nice and yellow, and then they harvest it.
Interesting. So that's just one chemical of like hundreds that are used on the food, as far as that goes.
There is, people are thinking that maybe this uptick in allergic reactions to wheat is caused by this more recent use of Roundup.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the last time we talked about the one-straw revolution, and this was Fukuoka in Japan, and it's an interesting story. He went through some epiphany in his youth about how everything is meaningless. The whole pursuit of money, the pursuit of career, and he quit his job and he inherited his father's farm in Japan, and he said, I don't want to do the way that everybody's farming. I'm going to do, he didn't even call it organic, I want to do natural farming, which meant when he started doing it, there were a lot of things that died, because he was trying to figure out, what does natural farming mean? What does nature require? What can I do to allow nature to produce the crops on its own? And so it took him a few years. He stopped flooding the rice fields. He wouldn't dye his mandarins. But he eventually got to the point where people would come there and study his methods, because he wasn't using any pesticides or whatever. So you've studied some of his work, right?
Yeah. He was kind of the he obviously he was doing his stuff before Bill Morrison, so he was the first permaculture.
I don't think Fukuoka ever used the word permaculture, did he? Because that was like a coined word, yeah.
That's very much what it was.
Yeah.
And
permaculture pretty much embodies any natural farming, any working with the land, letting it do its own thing, right?
Yeah, although Bill Mollison came up with a lot of ways to kind of optimize that.
I see.
So he kind of amped it up.
I know that in Fukuoka's second book or third book, he did, because One Straw Revolution, I highly recommend it to everybody to read that book. It's really inspiring. It was his path, how he went about things, but then he has more of a guidebook. I don't recall the name of it, but he has these triangles, and it's kind of like permaculture inspired, of how this relates to that and that relates to that. So in people's own backyards, do you see something that they could be doing that they're not doing today in general?
Yeah, it's not easy. In our previous house in Pasadena, we had good soil, but
you made it good soil, right?
I made it better.
You made it better, okay.
It started with good soil.
Okay, good.
And here we have just the most horrible soil that you have to use jackhammers to do anything.
Okay,
literally.
Right. Okay.
And
so each place is a little different. You have your own characteristics, yeah.
And also because I have some energy problems at the moment, I haven't been able to tackle it here yet.
Mm-hmm.
And because making soil like we have here, making that workable is just a very labor intensive.
Mm-hmm. But dealing with the soil would be step number one for most people. So you can actually grow things. What about? Well, I'll tell you what. Let's take a break, and then we'll come back, and then we'll continue talking about the kind of plants people should select. And I'd like to comment about your thoughts about when we've talked about Paleolithic and Neolithic. Those ideas about how we should think about our life.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll take a pause.
Yeah.
We're back with Carel Struycken. We're discussing permaculture and modern agriculture and solutions that we can do. So in the book 1491, that was my first exposure to Terra, Preta, and this is the way that people used to farm, where they weren't burning it down like clearing the fields. They were burning and then turning the charcoal into the soil. And some of the studies that I've read, they say you get up to 800% more productive soil by doing that.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting story. When what was the conquistador in Peru? Not Pizarro, but the other one.
The other one.
Yeah, okay, the other one. When he wanted to get rid of his brother because he was interfering too much, he sent him on an expedition down the Amazon. So basically from Peru. And his orders were to reach the Atlantic Ocean. And the description of that journey is that they never were not under attack. So along the whole Amazon, there were native tribes, settlements, non-stop.
It was heavily populated, in other words.
It was heavily populated, yeah.
And today it's not.
Today it's not, no. And because most Native Americans were not, couldn't deal with European smallpox.
The diseases, right. They died off, yeah.
So they died off. And they think that about 90% of the population...
It's a figure that I've heard too, yeah.
Yeah, both in North and South America. So it was heavily populated, but they were doing their agriculture in the forest. And so what they are discovering now, or what they have discovered in the last, 20, 30 years, is that when you think you're walking through a virginal jungle, it's actually, you're walking through a garden because the concentration of certain trees that are useful to people are much bigger in certain areas. So
and that's because somebody worked it in the past.
Yeah, and they have been consciously planted there or left alone and the other trees gotten rid of. Mm-hmm. And the reason they never had orchards is that then you get disease problems. So like a rubber plantation is impossible in South America because it would be killed off by all the some kind of a leaf blight or so. But if you have it interspersed with other trees, then it's not much of a problem.
So in other words, I think what you're saying is they were able to feed the population by not having orchards in the modern sense or farming in the modern sense, but they interspersed the food plants with the forest.
Yeah, and they had smaller gardens, but the settlements on average were a lot bigger though. So they obviously were doing agriculture on a larger scale, and they have found large areas in the Amazon that have this man-made soil, and in some areas it's something like 3 or 4 meters deep, and it's a mixture of chards, plant matter, so charcoal basically, and pot shards, an amazing number of pot shards.
So basically they mixed the old pots and they burnt things and blended it into the soil.
Yeah.
And they did that after generation after generation.
Right, right.
Interesting.
And I read a while back, I read a description of a tribe that was doing slash and burn, but whenever they burned, they would kind of cover it up with soil. So many of the traditional tribes are still doing the same. And of course, it's a process that happens over millennia.
So we were discussing this in the context, like this is the fall of 2019 right now, and in the news is all of the fires going on in the rainforest, and you were saying that's a little bit more complex than what the native people did, but the native people had a method of making it sustainable, where they would do burning and turning the charred material into the soil. And what's happening today on a large scale is maybe, what is it, a mix of that plus large farming operations?
No, they basically get rid of all plant or most of the plant matter because they need to do modern agriculture, so it needs to be flat, and there need to be no obstructions of tree trunks or whatever. And for instance, Fukuoka would leave branches, tree trunks in his orchard because it would, and he would even interplant it with leguminous trees and plants, and they would just let it rot, and it would kind of feed the soil again.
So he doesn't have to buy fertilizers and feed it.
At least 1/10 of. He was still spreading some chicken manure on his rice fields, but it was a lot less than.
So in terms of the average person who's aware of, they go to the store, they buy their food, they want to maybe do something in their own life, what kind of advice? I mean, we can't like really burn all the stuff in the backyard in most cities.
No.
That might be a solution to the soil, maybe in the rural areas, but what are some of the things that the average person could do to try to live, at least in their own backyard, more sustainably?
Well, you can, it all depends on how you grow your stuff, right? So if you have fruit trees, there are certain plants that you can grow around your fruit tree. I think.
Well, so that's a point right there. If you have fruit trees, if you have a lot of ornamentals, maybe they could be cut down and you could put some fruit tree, right?
If you choose the right ornamentals.
Well, that's right. Some ornamentals are produce fragrance or some other something useful.
Some ornamentals have flowers that attract the right kind of insects. So I had a lot of success, and a lot of this stuff is you have to just keep trying. And I planted anise to attract ladybugs.
That's true. Everything wasn't food in your yard, but it seemed like you had carefully gone through, and if the plant was not useful in some way, it wasn't there.
Yeah, but it was trial and error.
So, I mean, a lot of it is trial and error. There's all these gardening books, but the reality is you have to see what grows in your specific geography.
Right. And of course, here in Los Angeles or in Southern California, we don't have enough water. So anything that we can do to kind of keep water from evaporating and all that stuff.
So in other words, a lot of mulching. Don't rake up and throw your leaf trimmings away. Yeah.
Right.
Now we had talked about, just as maybe a philosophical thing, but the roots of humankind going into agriculture. Could you comment on that distinction between the Paleolithic human and the Neolithic? What that means?
Yeah. Well, it's kind of a mystery why people started agriculture, because it wasn't really necessary as long as people were living in small communities, spread out. There were fewer people, so it was easier to kind of find your niche. And they were, on average, they were pretty healthy. Of course, there was a lot of there were accidents. You were attacked by. There were more predators around, so you had to kind of.
We're talking how many years back in human history?
We're talking about 10, 15,000 years.
Okay, all right.
And then at a certain point, people started growing stuff. And it's such a mystery why they started doing that, that some people theorized that maybe it was some kind of a religious, a ritual thing.
I mean, I once read that, you know, wherever the settlements were, you had your trash heaps and certain seeds passed through the human body, and you'd see certain plants growing around your settlements. And so it was sort of accidental agriculture in a sense.
Yeah, well,
and it's convenient to have the thing growing next to home.
Yeah,
right?
But that's kind of how the Amazon Indians were doing it.
Okay.
But for instance, in Turkey, where I think agriculture started, you see kind of it's spreading as an idea. And the strange thing is that around the Mediterranean, at the moment that agriculture starts to be introduced, the stature of people gets about over a foot, maybe more than that, smaller. They get a lot of more disease, a lot more tooth decay.
So in other words, with the rise of agriculture, people's health declined and the tooth...
Things were getting a lot worse.
Interesting.
And
so we think of it as a necessary evil. I mean, today, everybody relies on modern agriculture, but the reports that I read when I read agricultural journals and just objective journals is that it's essentially not sustainable. It has to we have to do more and more and be more and more productive, and we can't have famine or insect infestation or we're really in big trouble.
Yeah, well, it's kind of the more agriculture, the more food you have, the population rises, right? And when the population rises, you have to produce more food. And in the Paleolithic, populations were pretty stable. So it wasn't that much of a problem.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I know that plenty of people are thinking about that. They're looking at where are we going into the future? And, I mean, to some degree, we could find answers in the past, although those answers may not be what you think. I mean, do you see a future where we can move agriculture to a more sustainable state? Or do you see bad things in the future, meaning lack of ability to feed such population?
It all depends on population growth, I guess. Yeah? And we in the West, we have this notion of everything needing to the production index needs to rise. So we always deal with things that need to go up. While, for instance, in the Amazon, it's a pretty stable cycle. I think 90% of the organic matter gets recycled by the plants themselves. Mm-hmm. And the rest strangely enough, gets blown in from the Sahara Desert.
Interesting.
So the soil and the topsoil in the Amazon is pretty shallow, and most of the nutrients seem to blow over from the Sahara.
Mm-hmm. Now, for somebody listening, would you advise them to read Mollison's book on permaculture?
Yeah, and there's a lot of current people who still proselytize.
Right. Well, there's workshops. You can see it on YouTube all over on permaculture. I mean, it is a way to think about it, but I think the individual, everybody wanting to be part of the solution wants to do something. There's a lot of little things you can do. I have my doubts about the state of agriculture because farmers will say they have to keep growing and getting more in order to break even, so you have that economic factor pushing everything.
Yeah, you have Well, for instance, in Washington State, a lot of farmers are experimenting with different kinds of wheats, different varieties of wheat, and they grow organically. You want to stop?
They grow organically, it's okay, yeah.
Okay, they grow organically because otherwise they can't sell it. And
Because that's what the public wants.
yeah, and
Yeah.
they get more money for
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
So there are farmers who switch to organic just because they can make more money that way.
Well, anyway, I know we brought up a lot of subjects. I mean, I'm always optimistic, but I have my doubts about with the economic incentive. Things always have to get bigger and better, and sometimes there's a price to pay somewhere along the way. Anyway, I hope people found some value in this, found some points of discussion, and I appreciate you taking the time.
All right, you're welcome.